with us today, speaking on economic vocabulary and opposition politics in India. Aditya is a lecturer at ANU and currently a fellow at the Harvard and Cambridge Center for History and Economics. He'll be on sabbatical in Harvard there next year. And he has a book coming out with Princeton University Press on free economy and opposition politics in India, a history, which I don't think is forming directly the basis of today's talk, but will be very relevant. And Pedro is a lecturer in international economic history at Cambridge. He has run the Inequality in History Network since 2012. And he works on the history of measurement of inequality, in particular with the Philomathea Trust grant that he's had the last few years. Today we're going to have a presentation by Aditya, followed by discussion with Pedro and Q&A. We're hoping to kind of maybe mix those up a bit. So if you've got questions as you go, then please leave them in the chat box, and either I'll call on you to ask them directly, or I'll read them out, and hopefully we can weave them into more of a conversation together. I'll just, if Una's able to put up the poll that we've been doing on your screens now, then you'll see 3 questions on gender, geography. We should really disaggregate this by time zone to work out what the best time zone is to be in to get different audiences. And the third is, are second-hand dealers in ideas more important than high theorists? So you can answer those and we'll share them in a second. But before we do, let me just tell you that we're going to we are going to keep running the seminar next term, probably in webinar format, so you can all keep joining from wherever you are. And we've got some really exciting speakers lined up. So please do keep looking out for those, either join our mailing list or follow us on Twitter. Okay, I'll give the poll just, I think that's pretty much everyone's voted. So if we can end the poll there, and I'll just share the results, which are positive for the theme of the session today, which is more important. So without further ado, I'll let Aditya start.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Alice and the conveners for their invitation. I really enjoyed tuning into the previous webinars in the series, and very much looking forward to our discussion today. And second, I want to thank Pedro, who was my teacher when I was an MPhil student, and whose course was, not exaggerating, was the highlight of the degree, which I've learned is going to be coming out, or at least parts of that course were coming out as a book co-authored with Purnima Paripathy of King's College London. It's great to see him after a long time. And finally, thank you all in the audience, number of familiar faces for being here today. So I guess I'll start with the screen share. Here we go. I'm always very scared about what will happen. Yes, okay. So today's sort of politics are across the world is sort of full of economic language, right? So politicians and publicists, newspaper writers, bloggers, tweeters, etc., across the world do not hesitate to use economic language to sort of make promises, attack their opponents, celebrate ideals, defend cherished communities, right? And people actually do Google Ngram searches to identify how prominent the usage of certain kinds of terminology is, right? I've kind of picked some examples from history in various parts of the world. At least growing up, for me, the major one that I used to hear a lot was in Democratic and in presidential debates when Republicans use the term small business to sort of defend their ideal kind of community of that they claim to represent, right? After moving out to Australia, I've learned that the package of reform policies introduced by the Labor government in the 1980s, of sort of liberalization, was defended as sort of economic rationalism, the idea that we're only doing what reason prompts us to do. Similarly, in the there's people in the audience will know about Thatcher. In the early 90s in Great Britain, John Major spoke of the right to own and the power to choose, sort of an example of powerful rhetoric to sell policies that are being pursued. And more recently, with the sort of rise of economic populism, you have people in the Front National, Marine Le Pen, and others talking about the eurozone and the end of sort of reclaiming monetary sovereignty. That will be familiar, of course, to those of you in Britain as well. Britain never joined the eurozone, or single currency, I suppose. So, in the Indian context, which is the context that I primarily study, the sort of economic rhetorician of the 2010s has been this man, Narendra Modi, right? And in the, in economic rhetoric has been an influential but rather understudied part of India's democratic history, right? At least, from the turn of the 20th century, from the sort of birth of kind of organized Indian politics to the sort of birth of electoral democracy, and until today, it's been quite important. Two important terms for Modi have been corruption, to sort of label his attack his opponents, those of the Congress Party, and development as far as what he promises, right? And so in the 2014 elections, when he first rose to power, he famously, one of the famous slogans of that campaign was "Enough with corruption, this time try Modi," right? So that's what the first quotation means. Similarly, 2 years later, when he was campaigning for the state elections in India's northern state of Uttar Pradesh, he sort of asserted triumphantly that development will win, development will always win, right? And in 2019, despite kind of poor economic growth record, et cetera, one of the lines that he continued to pursue was the sort of alleged corruption of the Congress Party, which had ruled India for much of its democratic history, alleging that the assassinated father of his sort of prime opponent had died the most corrupt man in Indian history, right? More recently, the rhetoric has kind of shifted, given the sort of depression in global demand for Indian goods and services, and sort of the immediate context of threats from Donald Trump, that if India did not release the supplies of hydroxychloroquine to the United States, there would be consequences. Right around that time, when the sort of rhetoric of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, came about, right, and sort of professions of usage of Indian-produced goods, right around the time sort of configuration with China developed, and so there was sort of banning of Chinese-owned apps and that sort of thing, right? But I think as will be clear, I mean, the relative coherence or specific concepts and policies that are associated with these terms are sort of loose and vague, right? However, this rhetoric remains influential in terms of the importance of the sort of secondhand dealers, right? Politicians and publicists, in terms of the kind of persuasion that they're trying to pursue, right? Which in scholarship, I suppose going back from a sort of self-analytical point that John Maynard Keynes made in dubbing the essays that he wrote from in the 1929 to 30 as essays in persuasion, to sort of more recent scholarly focus of Angus Bergen in his book, The Great Persuasion, has been more along the lines of academics adopting or working in collectives and adopting public-facing kind of language, right? Instead of that, I'm more interested in these kind of dealers themselves, right? But to sort of set the stage of what I'm talking about, right? This economic vocabulary, which I believe always has a sort of history, right? Is part of a study of kind of post-colonial India, right? And just to provide some context, after India won independence from the British Raj in 1947, the vanguard anti-colonial nationalist party, the Indian National Congress, or I'm going to call it Congress from now on, assumed the reins of government, right? There are parallels to the ANC in South Africa, the United Malays National Organization in Malaysia, etc. Right? It was sort of a one-party dominant system, right? The Constituent Assembly in India, which met from 1946 to 50, decided to introduce universal franchise, and the first general elections were held in 1952. Since then, they've been held every 5 years, and Congress won a kind of overwhelming majority, right? And so what political scientists describe as a kind of one-party dominant system was one whereby the Congress is sort of an umbrella group that really comprises of everything from the sort of moderate right to the moderate left and things in between, and different groups kind of compete for pressure, to sort of put pressure on the system. Sometimes parties outside will ally with a particular segment to help pull things one way rather than the other, right? So once the Congress won this majority in 52, they started to pursue, well, slightly earlier, but for our purposes, broadly around this time, they initiated a state-led model of planning, adopting a sort of mixed economic model of both public sector owned and private sector owned enterprises, with the strategic focus being on the public sector owned kind of heavy industry, and pursued a brand of import substituting industrialization, right? Famously in 1955, the Congress's sort of working committee asserts that the goal of planning will be a socialistic pattern of society, again, kind of deliberately vague, right? What did that mean? So the second plan period, which is conventionally associated with as a sort of classic case of planning, was a period whereby the investment of the state was concentrated towards developing heavy industry. Private business was regulated through a system of licensing and permits. There was also how limited foreign exchange was managed, right? Essential commodities were controlled, and so colonial era laws and laws instituted during World War II were sort of refashioned in ways that empowered the bureaucracy to kind of handle these limited resources, right? And the second plan was also one that was substantially deficit financed, right? About 9% of the allocations were basically to be paid for by printing money or by foreign aid. And India was sort of non-aligned, which has various kind of ideological dimensions that I won't get into. But strategically, this allowed India to get money from both the Soviets and from, in much more substantial degree, from the United States, right? Which is sometimes, I think, forgotten. Although the Americans were generally quite upset that the ideological bang for buck that was being delivered by that the Soviets were getting was much higher, right? Even though if you look at the quantities, and David Engerman has done a fantastic book on this, much more is coming from the United States, particularly in food aid, right? So what starts to happen when this model of planning is articulated and sort of policies are pursued both in the industrial arena and also, in the agricultural sector to try and reform land relations that are deeply unequal, is that you have sort of various constituencies that come together, right, to form this party that I look at, that I study, called the Freedom Party or the Swatantra Party, who are also kind of interested in this idea of a two-party democracy, right? They capitalize on the discontent with certain kind of planning, brings together a diverse set of dissidents, right? Everyone from the Maharani Gayatri Devi, who was at that time the world's most expensive wedding, and spent half of her time in London, to sort of peasant leaders speaking in kind of vernacular idioms, sort of clerks, small business owners, etc. Right? And what's interesting is that this was an almost exclusively economic platform on which the party ran, of what they called free economy. Now that, as I'll get into in my book, but won't necessarily talk so much about today, that was associated with various different kinds of visions. The party's last principle, sort of revealingly, was that, beyond the 20 economic principles articulated here, party members are free to sort of pursue whatever ideas and principles that they fancy, right? So in other words, they tried to sort of mimic the Congress in certain ways, but also kind of stigmatize it as the party that was sort of ranging on totalitarianism, right? And I think the Cold War context of this kind of gives more credence to what, if you read backwards today, looks quite a bit alarmist in some of their rhetoric, right? And I think it's sort of the responsibility of intellectual historians to kind of think about that rather than kind of caricature the arguments that were being made at the time. So a lot of time I've spent over the last several years thinking about the origins of this term, permit and license Raj, which was coined by the principal theorist of the Swatantra Party, and was also has also kind of endured to the present, right? And continues to characterize discussions on the Indian economy associated with the sort of planning state, right? So even though it was coined by a man named C. Rajagopalachari, who was a sort of regional leader, originally pipped as Gandhi's successor, then kind of falls out with Nehru, very religious man, etc., comes from small town India. The person who kind of helps him put together this precise terminology and connect what he believes to be the bankruptcy of the Indian state with the notion that inflation is rising is a man named B.R. Shenoy, who is an economist who studied at the LSE, who was sort of influenced by Hayek very much in his sort of early life. He studied with an Austrian economist who had been, an economist trained in the Austrian school in India before that, and he had some affiliation to the sort of nationalist movement, right? He was the party advisor of the Swatantra Party, and he was also involved in the Mont Pelerin Society, right? So he, writes to Rajagopalachari in a letter that, look, Congress party men by the thousands, corrupt officials are responsible for the issues of licenses and permits, contractors who are engaged in public sector projects, beneficiaries of community development projects, traders, businessmen, and industrialists. These are the people for whom planning has been good, and sort of everyone else is kind of left by the wayside, right? Inflation, which has risen, is the sort of quantitative metric that shows that this regime is not able to deliver what it promises because it depresses real wages, right? So Rajagopalachari kind of interprets this to think that, okay, well, permits and licenses are this sort of oppressive technology of the state, right? And he theorizes permit license Raj as a sort of oligarchic coalition of bureaucrats, politicians, and big business. Right? So big business feeds money to the coffers of the politicians. Politicians are associated with various favored bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats have this power to disperse licenses and permits, which are required for kind of transactions, right? And he says that this essentially corrodes the positive content of democracy, right? The term Raj is which connotes sort of imperial rule, right? Is a sort of classic case of conservative rhetoric. If you kind of read one of the sort of typologies given by Albert Hirschman in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, is sort of what he calls a jeopardy hypothesis, right? Jeopardy hypothesis being that what these, what the progressive groups are trying to do is essentially jeopardizing that which we do have already, and it's bringing a new kind of legacy of rule by plutocrats, right? And this is this becomes fairly successful. I mean, the miracle of the Swatantra Party is that it actually happened, rather than the fact that by the 1970s it kind of dies down. And in the 1960s, when the Congress first suffers major electoral losses, getting voted out of 8 states, losing, having its majority in parliament substantially diminished, and also forcing the country, the economic conditions force the country to go on a planned holiday, Swatantra emerges as the principal opposition, and through the court system actually successfully defends the right to property in various spaces, and with certain regional coalitions manages to help Congress get defeated and never sort of come back, right? So what happens in the 1970s is a sort of entirely different can of worms, because after Nehru's death, the person who is kind of inserted into the prime ministership dies after 2 years. The sort of party bosses responsible for the Congress kind of bring in Indira Gandhi because they think that she's pliable. She kind of has her own intentions, her own plans, and kind of maneuvers to dismantle the old kind of Congress party system and turns the Indian democracy in a more kind of populist direction, right? What ends up happening in terms of Indian political economy is that even though planning doesn't quite take place in the same way that it used to, they don't necessarily make major adjustments to the kind of model of capital accumulation and are kind of responding to the new global context and reacting to events that are taking place in the global economy, right? So the oil shocks are a big one. Increasingly, India has got foreign exchange problems and is responding to pressures from the Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and the World Bank. And so while on the one hand you have policies like, dispensing with the constitutional right to property, on the other hand, you've got policies like, increasing subsidies for farmers, the pursuit of a high-yielding seed high-yielding varieties of seeds so that you can become agriculturally self-sufficient with technology from the United States. You have certain kinds of import liberalization and that sort of thing. And you start to have the first kind of private company go on the stock market in the late 70s. And then you get kind of, I would say, bits and pieces of movement towards reform in the 1980s. Even though this is not kind of expressed in organized politics, there are sort of social constituencies that are increasingly, thanks to sort of changes in the global economy in the sort of post-Bretton Woods era, that are increasingly sympathetic to this sort of thing. And so in 1991, when India faces a kind of unprecedented balance of payments crisis, you pursue kind of large, meaningful liberalization reforms. I'm going to sort of stop there, realizing that I've gone hideously over time. But just to say that the permanent license Raj, and something I suppose we'll talk about more, continues to be something that is discussed when thinking of the historical period between the beginning of planning and the 1990s. And one of the things that happens in the 1970s is that you have economic policy centralized, but it's sort of, and the power of bureaucrats kind of becoming increasingly substantial, but also kind of arbitrary. And so what you continue to have is a immensely powerful discretionary allocation of resources. And so, and a lot of the, and what that sort of as an organized sort of constituency of power, that's also arrested in some sense progress towards further liberalization. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we can talk about sort of contemporary Indian political economy as well as sort of field questions.
Thank you very, very much, Aditya, and let me also echo the thanks to the organizers, to Cleo, Alice, and also support for this great series of seminars, and to say that of course when Aditya is talking about this long time ago when he was an MPhil student, it's not that long time ago. It was very, very recent for me. It's just that he's very precocious and very successful in a short period of time. But it's a pleasure to hear Aditya and his usual sort of broad, sweet, but incisive take on a really important but largely neglected question, which is the economic debate around economics and the politics of economics in India since independence, which I am not an expert or very knowledgeable on, but very interested and avid reader. So my questions are those of an ignorant listener trying to chart my way through a fascinating but complex topic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Swatantra and also about the debates around planning, economic reform, and liberalism in the Indian context. And perhaps to get at that, I was wondering, Aditya, if you could tell us a bit more about how do you read what's happening in terms of the government's intervention into development through the 1950s and 1960s, the heyday of planning. Something I've been reading more recently about the attempts of the BJP to reform the economic system have often come up against quite entrenched forms of relatively hidden, or at least not known to those of us outside of India, of public welfare. They are quite extensive, but of course look very different to what we've normatively assumed are the kinds of welfare system that were developed in the productivist model of post-war industrial economies in Europe and North America. So, for instance, I'm thinking about kind of you talked about the direct subsidies to particular constituencies such as farmers, food grants, and a variety of other things. So this is a bit about, we know it's relatively familiar to think about the planning in terms of import substitution, about the industrialization, about sort of industrialized-led development. But on the side of the social welfare side of the equation, how did it work, and what kind of legacies is that left in terms of the politics of economic planning?
Yeah, no, thank you, Pedro. That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think that the sort of subsidies. So I guess, in the Nehruvian era, right? So the 50s until mid 1960s, the sort of welfare was understood more as a set of entitlements for everybody. You had a government take control of the food supply, control prices. You had sort of certain kinds of fair price shops and such. But broadly speaking, it was only really in the 1970s when you kind of had more kind of means targeted or constituency targeted levels of subsidies, right? And I think this is also something that the Indian case is a particular, not in terms of the number of constituencies and the number of programs, and ones that are politically saleable as the electorate kind of fragments into caste and region-based groups, but it becomes this becomes a kind of way of moving or changing the terms of sort of political sort of debate from one about the broader plans to what can I sort of promise you, right? And when the pivot that is sort of initiated in the Indira Gandhi era is that the sort of language of politics becomes much more about these, direct appeals, not the planned nation, but about I'm going to abolish poverty. And so what does that mean for you? And the combined with what's going on at the center, you have a sort of federal model, right? State politicians, right, are making appeals based to communities based on a different kind of rationale of, well, these are the sorts of things that the community will benefit from, and it becomes about using state resources to kind of distribute benefits, right? So this is the sort of the pivot that you see as the electorate becomes a larger one, and you kind of democracy moves into being something that is participated in by the few that sort of know about it, and adjusting to that, I suppose, vernacularization in a sense. But the other is also that you don't have a new model, right? You don't have a new, at this point, you're still very, in the 1970s, the Cold War is still very much on. India takes pride in being a sort of key member of the non-aligned movement. There's sort of a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. You haven't really moved away from what you were doing before into a kind of new paradigm. And so the thing to do then is to use the resources of the state to try and deal with pressure, right, through these kinds of subsidies and populist appeals, and those things that deliver you shorter term but larger electoral majorities. Having said that, the sort of means targeting and such is also something that becomes more and more prominent in development discourse from the 1970s. So sort of wonderful book called Rethinking Capitalist Development by Kalyan Sanyal kind of talks exactly about this, how this transition is made. So it is a specific case, but there are sort of some general characteristics, I would say.
Thank you. And just on that, and to link what you said very interesting there about the changing of the electorate, the changing relationship to the emergence of a opposition to Congress from the 1970s onwards, and bring you back to something you mentioned briefly in your talk, which is the development or at that period, articulations of economic populism. And that is where I perhaps want to ask you a bit more about Swatantra, which is, does it, in your opinion, develop a particular kind of economic populism, or is it really speaking to very specific? So breaking down the idea of populism, who is the popular for Swatantra? Yeah. Is it a particular class? Is this kind of petty bourgeoisie, small proprietors, business people that you're talking about? Or does it also develop a wider rhetoric of economic populism, trying to reach a wider, presumably, property-less or poorer constituency? And how does it do so?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I try to explore is who exactly is Swatantra's target, right? And I think I think that Swatantra would be the last of the Swatantra at some level is an artifact of the Nehruvian era, even though it's trying desperately to redefine its features. And you sort of see the decline of sort of coherent ideology in Indian politics, Indian political debate after the 60s, right? So Swatantra is trying to appeal to what they call the middle class citizen, right? So it's interesting because in a polity that doesn't really have a bourgeoisie, right? Because you haven't undergone, or a powerful bourgeoisie, you have a small bourgeoisie, right? But it is the sort of dominant coalition, to take the sort of classic 1980s analysis, is rich farmers, some kind of bourgeoisie, and then you have kind of a managerial bureaucratic elite, right? And so in the absence of that, making an appeal to the middle class citizen, well, of course, in a country as diverse as this, the middle class looks like very different wherever you're looking, right? So you have Minu Masani, who is the general secretary of the party based in Bombay, who is essentially sketching a caricature in the cartoons that he gets published for the party, of somebody who looks very much like the common man who runs in the Times of India editorials, or in the Times of India cartoons, right? A sort of urban, educated, reading the newspaper, etc. I mean, that's not really middle class, whichever way you think about it, right? For NG Ranga, the peasant leader in the South, the middle class is the owner proprietor who owns 8 acres of land. Again, if you think about it with respect to where that person is in the income distribution, it's not really middle class, right? So it's an attempt to forge a class politics in a country in which that class, not having experienced that particular form of industrialization and driven by so many other different divisions, it's very difficult to put something like that together. What they're still able to do is to assemble some kind of degree of coherence on people like Gandhi, or ideas like national unity, freedom, etc. But the moment you kind of push more deeply into that to see what these constituent visions are, they're quite interesting in and of themselves, but they're really quite diverse.
Thank you. I think on keeping us on this moment of the 50s and 60s, I think Bruce Caldwell had a question about. Bruce, would you like to?
Yes, I have a question about the evolution of this concept of the permit and license barrage, because when you introduced it in your talk, you emphasized the use by big business of this government licensing apparatus to maintain itself in the face of small business. But I'm wondering also, and you've just recently talked about the types of coalitions that might have formed behind such a concept. But I was wondering whether the concept itself may change through time. So when I hear the concept, and maybe this is just the American kind of ears that I bring to it, I would think of the notion of you have to either have connections or pay bribes in order to get something through the system, and that's quite a different concept from the kind of crony capitalism that you were talking about, where the large firms are able to control the thing. There's also notions that have been built in about the length of time it takes to start a business, and how that makes for difficulty for smaller businesses. So that would go along with your first one. So I'm just wondering whether the concept itself is sufficiently fluid that it can take into account lots of different sorts of arguments. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bruce. I mean, I think one of the things that I kind of wanted to point out, but I suppose I ran out of time, was that, yeah, the permit license barrage as we talk about it today, right? There's sort of two ways, right? There's thinking of the 47 to 91 period, right? As one in which, it was just very difficult for private business to operate. There's one which is, okay, it is whatever the sort of vestiges of the old economy that persist into the present that have to be kind of chipped away. But the issue of crony capitalism versus I suppose the idea of paying bribes to sort of get ahead, right? Where it's really the bureaucrats that are the problem, or at least and that the sort of state and business are kind of opposed. I think that in the original articulation, it was more around the issue of crony capitalism and oligarchy, right? And I think that what it has sort of morphed towards, the issue is that big business in and of itself, so Swatantra to an extent relies on a fraction of big business for support. The Tata Group, the other major business house, the Birlas, think that it's easier to get their nest feathered by the Congress, right? And big business in and of itself is not, is somewhat nonplussed about the liberalization reforms, because it means that they're going to get competition, right? So if we're kind of going to talk about this strictly speaking, right, rather than as a rhetorical construction of the 1960s for a very specific political purpose, right? What we see is that the idea that big business is controlling and accumulating disproportionately the licenses is basically correct. I mean, the sort of work that comes out by these sort of government-sponsored committees and whatnot essentially confirms that they are attaining kind of disproportional support, even if you adjust for the fact that these are the sort of biggest players in town and they would get more and whatnot. Whether or not this is hollowing out the positive content of democracy is something that I think is more kind of up for debate. And I think that, as time has gone on, right, the issue has been increasingly, it's more an issue for sort of small businesses getting permits and working kind of through exactly what you say today, the issue of having to deal with grease palms and whatnot to get ahead. I don't think that there are certain big businesses certainly that exert kind of disproportionate influences on politics, but the way that numbers have kind of shaken out is that it remains difficult for sort of small business, but it's hard to say that big business kind of controls the way things move.
Thank you, Aditya. I do have a question to take us forward onto sort of the more recent times, but there are two really interesting questions here from Ben and Raghunath on that take us back to the Swatantra era, and perhaps trying to summarize both. Ben is asking whether you see Swatantra as part of a global sort of anti-left political economy idea, given its links to Hayek, the Mont Pelerin Society, and the Swatantra's own oppositions to the Communist Party of India land reform program. So really, to what extent you see Swatantra as part of this transnational network of a critique of left-wing socialistic economic policy. And Raghunath is asking about someone I hadn't heard about, but someone sounds very interesting, Charan Singh and his rural politics and movements, and whether there was some convergence between the vision of Charan Singh and the economic worldview of Swatantra, presumably Swatantra being more focused on an urban constituency and Singh on a more rural constituency. I wonder if you could take those two questions and tell us what you.
So the first would be say, thank you to both of them. I've interacted with both Ben and Raghunath in the past, so it's great to have them here. So yeah, with respect, I mean, one of the things that I guess Ben has actually just completed an MPhil about economic conservatism in India. So one of the things is that that I kind of try to argue is that I think it's worth thinking about the transnational networks of these actors, but at the same time, it's very specifically importing this kind of language for local political purposes, right? I mean, I don't think that a figure like Rajagopalachari is actually quite critical of the United States, even if he believes that India should be more aligned with the US and that it's a sort of lesser evil. One of the things that I am concerned about when we think about these sorts of issues in global terms is that, when we move from the point of origin, or at least the way in which this is sketched, to the points where I'm kind of looking at, it essentially looks like imperfect imitation or sort of filtration or derivative discourse, etc. And so what I kind of want to guard against is that by providing a kind of deep local contextualization of what's going on. But I do think that, yes, this is a chapter, right, one step removed from superpower competition of the global Cold War, which is important to acknowledge and think about, right? So yes, I mean, I guess to answer your question in the classic academic response, yes and no. Right? So Raghunath, I think I think Charan Singh is really interesting, right? Because what ends up happening in the 1960s is with the Green Revolution, right? You have a class of kind of rich farmers that often are sort of from landowning dominant caste, the other backward classes that become quite dominant and kind of demand a share of what's going on, renegotiating the kind of coalition, right? So a figure like Charan Singh basically threatens to exit the Congress, renegotiates terms, and then comes back. When he's exited the Congress to form the BKD, he briefly considers a kind of merger with Swatantra, and then they kind of fall apart. But the difference is substantial, right? Because in terms of the level of ideology, because even though you have interests in Swatantra that are interested, like NG Ranga, the peasant leader who is, who wants more resources given to rural areas against the urban, against the urban groups. At the same time, there's a question of whether or not subsidies, which Charan Singh ultimately accepts, are the best way of going about this, if that's really free economy in the way that it is kind of being envisioned. So I think that tension is one that is never quite addressed. And similarly, I think the issue is that one of the driving arguments of my book is about how the communities that define Swatantra, not necessarily the vote banks, right? That's a sort of sad story of feudal interests in the north getting Swatantra the votes, and much less interesting in my opinion. But it's ideologically driven from leaders who come from these landowning dominant communities or mercantile communities who have either been involved in some kind of commercial capitalist enterprise or transitioning towards kind of an agrarian form of capitalism or embracing small industrial capitalism, who are, unpleased with the Nehruvian agenda, which is not making very much space for them, right? And so in that sense, it is quite a distinct regional political movement from the prosperous Green Revolution farmers of the Punjab and other parts of North India.
Thank you, Aditya. And I suppose now perhaps is the right time to kind of bring us forward in time. And I'd like to ask you to develop. I know you ended on this a little bit in your quick presentation, but given these strands, to tell us a bit more how you read the BJP's economic version of economic populism, and how does it sort of draw on these themes or transform them, and what do you think that's new about its own form of economic populism?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I think that this is sort of a puzzling kind of question, right? There's sort of one school of thought which is that, look, the BJP kind of shapeshifts, the BJP and its predecessor, the Janasangh, right, kind of shapeshifts to the demands of the moment, right? So in the 50s, they said that they were cooperative socialists, whatever that means. Didn't really mean very much to them. They had, they were one of the few parties, along with the communists, actually, who rejected liberalization or voted against it in parliament because they said, well, look, this is going to unleash foreign interests, which are going to capture the traditional base of the BJP's predecessor, Janasangh, which was essentially urban traders, right? And later on, when the BJP finally comes to power in 1998, it actually pursues some substantial kind of liberalization reform. Now, of course, one could say similar things of the trajectory of the Congress, but the fact is that there was never a kind of dominant ideological vision. I've done some research looking at what the predecessor party was saying in the 50s and 60s, and this sort of strong idea of creating the conditions for your small trader and small family business owner to produce is the kind of the way in which they want things to kind of move, right? And so that means investing a lot in roads. That means preventing kind of large monopolies from operating, that sort of thing, right? Suppressing labor so that small firms can hire them, so it can hire workers, etc. But then, obviously things are very different when you actually come to power and you have to deal with all of these constituencies, right? And so what has actually ended up happening is after, the BJP came to power, they have essentially they've retained a number of the policies that they criticized under the Congress regime. One of the important ones being the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, right, which essentially the government guarantees 100 days of employment for anybody who lives in a rural area, right, because it's just immensely popular and they'd be electorally decimated without it. During the 2019 elections, the government basically made huge promises about healthcare spending and that sort of thing. But at the same time, the government has pursued kind of policies that might strike you as strange, like the demonetization of the Indian rupee in 2016, which basically hurt their cash economy trader base, right? So it's very difficult. I think the question is, how does the BJP try to make certain kinds of policies in this sort of odd cocktail justifiable one way or other? And it's hard to say because, on the one hand, there is a vein of its sort of original support base, right? Which, who have done poorly with liberalization, right? And there's a sort of a factional group called the Swadeshi, or the this indigenous in Indian kind of forum for awakening that essentially wants to roll back foreign direct investment and multinational entry. But on the other side, you've got this support base of all these trolls that you see on Twitter, et cetera, or people employed in large multinational firms who are very, very excited about liberalization policy for the economy. And you have certain kinds of sectors, maybe the large, heavier industrial sectors, the railways, et cetera, that are being disinvested from. But on the other hand, you have things like the banking sector, right, where some kind of disinvestment is planned. But unfortunately, what that means is that the easy credit that has been flowing to the business interests that bankroll the BJP, right, will essentially now be clamped down upon, right? And so that kind of creates a problem. So it's very, I apologize for not answering your question with a more definitive response. But what I would say is that, within these structural constraints imposed, right, the BJP is certainly moving towards, the sort of liberalization side, right? But that is more from the perspective of the state ownership of industry, right, rather than the redistributive kind of aspirations. And even within that, I would say that they continue to dole out subsidies to interest groups that are not the very poorest, and the investment in things like primary education, health, et cetera, continues to be remarkably poor because it doesn't pay the electoral, and there are various reasons for that, the electoral dividends that you might expect. What the BJP has been very good about doing is through its sort of affiliate organizations, right, is basically doing private service provision in areas in which they don't necessarily have a footprint, and essentially building up rapport through the RSS, which is a sort of parent organization, and essentially, basically giving out, let's consider it the equivalent of like private soup kitchens and whatnot. And then when it comes election time, well, you may look favorably upon these guys, who are politicians, and we don't do what they do, but, so that's the kind of the way that works. So it's very complicated.
So that's really interesting. So in a way, what you mentioned earlier about this sort of Janus-faced economic rhetoric continues to affect, and partly we expect that because of the federal nature of the system, the very diverse and distinct constituencies that anyone who wants to get to power at the federal level has to speak to so many different and rather differently constituted interest groups, that it becomes difficult to have any kind of one single coherent message. And now turning that in terms to the other side, to the forces that are now in opposition in India,
right,
who are trying to articulate an opposition to the BJP, including on its economic management. How do you see, do you see any difference? Do you see any kind of narrative directed to a broader public, proposing a different, an alternative form of economic management? Or do you find the same dispersal and multiplicity of messages?
Yeah, so I think that broadly, I think that, it is a sort of similar multiplicity on the other side, particularly coming from the Congress. But I do think that in some of the regional parties, you have, and that's, I suppose, a broader conversation for another time, you do have more coherent kind of economic policy around a particular ideological framework. The Left Front in Kerala, right, which has been, of the Indian states, the most successful throughout the sort of COVID crisis and such, has a very kind of substantial, substantially different and more coherent policy. Now, of course, the issue is that the top line growth comes from migrant workers who are remitting money back from the Gulf. So the distribution is all done very well. But essentially, there's no kind of industrial development being pursued, and to the extent that these people come back, they then invest in real estate, right? So you have, so ideologically, this kind of works for the time being, But yeah, I think that you don't have an alternate, except for sort of in technocratic circles in terms of political parties. I don't think that one can confidently say that you have a particularly striking alternative.
In a sense, do you think that is that partly because the politics are principally not going to be decided on on perceptions of economic competence, and that something else dominates the political debate, as perhaps in a different way than it has in the past in different contexts? Or am I reading too much into the way in which we tend to have our news about Indian politics filtered in this country?
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that the political economy bit is important, but it's not everything. But I also think that one has to kind of look at the different levels in which things are going on. So at the level of ideology being peddled by the sort of dominant party, right? It's what you see something that's very coherent is about a Hindu idea of India, the marginalization of Muslims, etc. Things about discussion of national defense and unity, right? But at the sort of lower level, right, it's still very much a black box, I guess. But at the lower level, what you have is these service organizations giving out kind of people money in more kind of strategically efficacious ways. The old kind of patronage model, right, that was pursued in the sort of 50s and 60s in the sort of old Congress. That system was sort of dismantled, and it was sort of replaced by sort of rotating chairs around Indira Gandhi. And so, I think that the political economy bit works. It still continues to be important, but not at the level that it's sort of driving political discourse in the mainstream media. And so I think that that's kind of important. And so there's the most perceptive analyst of, I think, contemporary Indian history, Sudipto Kaviraj, sort of post-colonial theorist. I think he's basically right to say that the sort of ideological debate on political economy and its correlation to electoral performance and outcomes is that link is sort of severed a long time ago.
Thank you. I've got that. There's so much more that I'd like to go into. I'd like to go back into the 40s, 50s, and 60s and talk about India's very vibrant print culture and discussions of kind of popular discussions of economics in those media. But also, I wonder if other people in the call have any questions they want to ask.
I'm just going to say that we started 5 minutes late and nobody's kicking us out of the lecture hall. So if you're all happy to stay or feel free to leave, of course, then we can keep going until the 10 minutes over.
Thank you, Alice. I think there is so much here, and I think, Aditya, what you're pointing us towards is the richness of this theme. But perhaps going back to my last point and taking us back, thinking about the discussion of economics in your second-hand pairs of ideas,
right?
Throughout the post-colonial India, where do you see them being active? Is there an audience, and how is it? Where is it constructed for the popular debates about economics and economic policy?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, to me, the golden ages would be in the 50s and 60s, which is why I sort of study them. But yes, I think that these popularizers continue to be important, but in different sort of circles, right? I mean, there's a guy called Swaminathan Iyer who's been writing He's actually a member of the sort of Cato Institute. I don't know if he's a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, but who penned a very influential economics column in the Times of India called Swanomics for many years, and he had a sort of large following. And so I think that in terms of informed sections of sort of elite opinion, these kinds of figures continue to be important. I think that at the regional level, you have a parallel set of people who are writing in Indian languages. Again, topic that is woefully understudied, who are kind of involved in this sort of thing. But I think that for a vast majority of people, other than their own kind of quotidian reflection on circumstances of daily life and the kind of political rhetoric that they receive when somebody's trying to canvass for votes, I think that sort of debate that doesn't exist, right? So you have, I would say, multiple sort of fragmented public spheres, sort of elite public spheres in which this is going on, right? And then underneath that, you have a different world. What Partha Chatterjee would call your sort of political society, which remains kind of to some extent untouched by these secondhand dealers, right?
I wonder if, I think my challenge would be, does it, or are we not being very good at finding
them?
How it does? And
right, the sort of Spivak question: if the subaltern does speak, are we able to listen?
Yes, that's something that I've become, in different contexts, more and more interested. Is how do we, people try to approach it from, Chatterjee on the question, politics of the governed, the economics of the governed, if you will, or some people returning to the old concepts of moral economies and trying to rethink them in different contexts. I think that would be one of the many areas that would be fascinating to return to.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, so then you have to kind of interrogate, and, one of the questions that I kind of try to ask in my research is, how do we distinguish between economic consciousness and economic thought, right? And, if you, take a sort of classic of American history, the ideological origins of the American Revolution, right? And even then, I think, Bernard Bailyn is talking about figures who are more elite than literate farmer writing pamphlets is going to be different from some of the people that I'm thinking about in India. So I think that there is a question, there's a sort of issue of, can we look at kind of popular mobilization around certain events? So in the 70s in India, you have these anti-inflation protests in which masses and masses of people participated. Right? Now, I would, my dream would be able to sort of write a history of, a common man or woman in that engaged in that particular sort of thing, and what are their sort of reflections on what a just society should look like. Now, unfortunately, I think that kind of research lends itself better to anthropology, sociology. I think it's very difficult for historians to access that. I do look at some of these. The Swatantra Party ran these anti-inflation and anti-tax days, which is interesting because the left was doing the same thing, and carrying, basically procuring, these sort of monster petitions, which had 20,000, 30,000 people sign them and taking them to Parliament. But again, what? I think we go back to sort of, I suppose, Garrett Stedman Jonesy questions in rethinking chartism. So what is that? What can we valuably say from that about the thoughts inside the head of somebody who's sort of participating? So I guess,
no, absolutely, and I think that there is scope, but there are limits, as you say. I'd be interested as well in thinking. I was thinking of the work of another colleague that we both know, Alexia Yates, on on trying to kind of unravel the actual economic choices and actions of broader numbers of people, through their personal savings. You mentioned remittances, and then what people do with their remittances. What kinds of investments, and I think there's all kinds of interesting things bound up with that can be looked at not just through a kind of economics, a lens of economic rationality, but one that interprets those also in the context of political ideas, economic ideas, and those particular popular understandings of risk, of opportunity, of security. That could be really interesting. But that's just an example of how what you're doing, mapping out and analyzing these debates, just opens up and gives us a fantastic overview that's essential and opens up so many other questions at all kinds of levels. And that's why I'm really excited to read your book and seeing the next project come through as well.
Well, thank you so much, Pedro. No, I mean, I think that's yes. I think the question of economic thought and economic life, if we're to sort of use those terms, and what we could take the sort of Antonio Gramsci point that everybody is an intellectual, but not everybody performs the social function of the intellectual, and that maybe we should study the kind of organic intellectuals to think about this. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that even beyond the question of the intellectual, there's the sort of quotidian choices and what that says about popular consciousness that are important, and that the better we understand, I think the better we can interpret what comes off to us as totally incomprehensible. So.
Can I just, Bridges, before finishing, ask a really quick question about the methodological? I was really struck, and I love the papers that you've written on this, but I was kind of struck by the endurance of particular institutions like LSE, the sites in which you located economic thinkers. And I was wondering if, those methodological choices, if there were other institutions that you'd thought of, and how that might have led to the story unwinding differently about how we located economic thinkers.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the question of institutions is kind of important, but at the same time, so institutions as a site where people meet, as a site where they kind of try to learn different things, some sort of principles. But I guess to me, the risk of that is that it often gets portrayed as indoctrination that takes place at in a particular forum, right? And then kind of spreads out all over the world, sort of contagion, right? And I think that, so whereas the LSE is an important place for, B.R. Shenoy, it's probably not that important for Minu Masani. Being in England in the 1930s and coming from, elite anglicized Parsi family growing up in Bombay is probably much more kind of, interesting. And the other thing is just sort of think about the intellectual diversity of a place like the LSE in the 1930s and 40s, right? I mean, you have Bruce is sort of we're world expert on the interwar period LSE, and 40s and 50s, and so yeah, I think that while the institutional background, particularly at this particular era that looks at, has certain connotations about class and sort of nuts and bolts about concepts, and provides interesting ground for finding sources, and even kind of social networks. I think in terms of ideas, it performs some function, but that function is a limited one.
That's great. Thank you, Aditya. It's good. Left me with much to think about for the rest of the day. So it just leaves me to thank everyone for joining, and Pedro and Aditya for a really wonderful discussion today. It's been a great conversation to end on, and we really hope to continue these conversations next term. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful summer. I hope you're all getting a break of some small description.
Thank you, Alice, very much. And thank you, Aditya.